When Richard II gave up his crown, he made Henry IV promise to spare his life. But promises can be broken. Henry made sure Richard's end was unspeakably brutal. King Richard II was one of the most notorious monarchs to sit on the English throne. Shakespeare may have immortalized his villainous reign, but his true story is both darker and much more complicated. Richard was a faker from the start. Born in 1367 to Edward the Black Prince and Joan, Countess of Kent, Richard wasn't even born in England, the country he was soon to rule. The future king was actually born in southwestern France, in the port city of Bordeaux, officially making him Richard of Bordeaux. And from the moment he came into the world, he started a whirlwind. For all that he had massive mental deficiencies, Richard was physically blessed. He was 6 foot tall and handsome. And although he lost his grip on reality at the end, he was an intelligent, well-read man. He did, however, have one flaw. When he was upset, he would stammer. His birth and inheritance were unusual in more ways than one. First of all, the future king wasn't even the son of a king. His father, Edward, was Prince of Wales and next in line for the throne. But Richard was also his youngest son. The fact he ever made it to the throne was a miracle, and it only came through great tragedy. When he was just a boy of 4, his older brother Edward died from the bubonic plague at just 6 years old. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last time the devastating illness altered Richard's life. The passing of Richard's brother took a severe toll on his father. He had contracted dysentery, and the grief turned his illness fatal. Richard's father died before ever reaching the throne. Richard was only 10 when he became King of England. His coronation ceremony was a 2-day affair with massive pageantry. London let the wine run, literally. There was wine flowing from fountains throughout the city to celebrate. While the wine was flowing and the parades were marching during Richard's coronation, people were also given their very own castle. The massive temporary structure stood in the centre of London, and 4 maidens stood in its 4 towers, showering the young Richard with gold as he marched by for the ceremony. When he was just 14, he faced his first real test as king. In 1381, the infamous Peasants Revolt erupted after the king raised the country's taxes. Groups of men blocked, mobbed and burned down key sites all over the capital. It was pandemonium, but not for Richard. He was hiding out in the Tower of London. Eventually he realised that if he wanted to hold on to his crown, he had to assert himself. On June 13th, he set out on the River Thames to meet the rebels and negotiate. Richard helped disband the Peasants' Revolt by granting clemency to the rebels, only to quickly revoke the order. Then he did one better and went out on the battlefield himself to personally squash any of the stragglers. Being a king with vast resources, he was terrifyingly successful, and it had devastating consequences for the rest of his reign. The Peasants' Revolt baptised Richard II in blood, and he never forgot the dark lessons he learned over those few formative days. As he aged, he started to guard his crown ever more jealously, eventually becoming a staunch defender of his absolute power. At the height of his reign, Richard corrupted himself to cartoon villain proportions. Convinced that he was God's chosen one, the king became notorious for how bad he was at interacting with commoners. He was incredibly susceptible to flattery and spent most of his reign insulating himself in his court with his various favourites. Although he was ruinously vain, some historians believe there were even darker forces at play during Richard's ill-fated reign. Some historians have gone so far as to claim that he had schizophrenia, while the most recent work suggests he suffered from a narcissistic personality disorder. Richard II's focus on arts and culture did have some upshots. English was developing as a literary language during this time, and Richard's refined court did a lot to help it along. In fact, the father of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer, worked in the king's court early in his career, and his writing paved the way for other titans like William Shakespeare. Richard didn't just enjoy paintings of himself, he was also a fan of gaudy jewellery and textiles, and spent massive amounts of money on baubles to adorn both himself and his loved ones. Though history has consumed many of these items, one of the most breathtaking achievements of Gothic jewellery, Queen Anne's crown, is still around today. Richard was a growing king, which meant he needed a queen. His eye fell on Anne of Bohemia, whose pedigree was as good or even better than his own. Her father was Charles IV, aka the Holy Roman Emperor. Their union might have looked like a political match from the outside, but the truth was much different. Everyone hated the idea of Richard and Anne becoming a couple, except Richard and Anne. Anne brought no dowry to England, but the king only wanted her anyway. In fact, he had to pay her family for the privilege of marrying her. They were both 15 years old, and they married at Westminster Abbey on January 20th, 1382. In 1387, Richard II's reign really started to fall apart at the seams when a faction of Parliament called the Lords Appellant finally managed to oust all his favourite courtiers from power. But Richard had been playing the Game of Thrones since he was 10, and he eventually regained control, then dealt them a brutal revenge. After resecuring his power, Richard tracked down almost every last one of his enemies and executed them. But he wasn't finished yet. In an ultimate bad guy move, he then went out into the countryside and executed any of the common people who had supported the lords. Thus began a new age, Richard's tyranny. Although they never had any children, Richard and Anne shared a blissful 12 years together, and many historians believe she was as good for his reign as she was for his heart. She made him more compassionate and moderated his violent tendencies in matters of state, and he repaid her with almost complete devotion, until the day it all came crashing down. In 1394, an old enemy of Richard II's came knocking. That year, his beloved wife Anne fell ill with the bubonic plague, the same disease that had killed Richard's brother and weakened his father. Soon after contracting the illness, Anne died at her home in Sheen Manor. Richard was so devastated and grief-stricken that he even had Sheen Manor demolished so that he'd never have to look at it again. For the rest of his reign, he was irrational and increasingly cruel. He wasn't above taking out his personal frustrations on his political life. While travelling to Scotland on a campaign, he got the heartbreaking news that his mother had passed. Richard's reaction redefined unhinged. Perhaps venting his feelings, he let his men loose on Edinburgh, and together they nearly destroyed the city. Through with the ravages of love, he decided to orchestrate a strictly political marriage with the French princess Isabella of Valois instead. Sounds fairly normal until you learn that Isabella was 6 years old at the time of their engagement. Richard was 29. Surprisingly, marrying a virtual toddler was frowned upon even in medieval England, but when his advisors brought up that issue, Richard didn't seem to care. He flippantly responded that each day would make the problem go away. Richard made a fatal error when he took vengeance on the Lord's appellant. He let a precious handful of members live, including his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. If that name sounds familiar, that's probably because he's the man who would soon violently overthrow Richard and become King Henry IV. But it's how Henry did it that's gone down in infamy. Richard II had been the big man on campus for decades, but even he recognised that Henry Bolingbroke was a threat. Henry's royal blood saved him from execution in the Purge, but Richard went further than that. To placate him, Richard made Henry a duke. Richard made another catastrophic miscalculation around this time. He said he didn't care that his wife Isabella was a child, but he should have. Richard was still childless at the time of his second wedding, and Isabella wasn't about to be of childbearing age anytime soon. This lack of an heir made him even more vulnerable to the coup on the horizon. In the end, Richard might have escaped with his crown and his life if it weren't for his panicked decisions. Henry Bolingbroke wasn't willing to make any moves on the throne until Richard dealt him a blow. First, he had Henry exiled. Then, when Henry came into an inheritance, Richard seized all his properties and extended his exile in a bid for control. Whereas Richard II's ancestors were mighty warrior kings, he took a much different approach. Instead of spending most of his time fighting with his men, he built up his own private army to do his bidding without needing to lift a finger himself. This helped shape him into our modern image of a distant king sat in the centre of a lavish court, but it also led to his downfall. Eventually, Henry Bolingbroke forced his way back into England to claim his inheritance. He couldn't have chosen a more perfect time. Richard was away in Ireland, along with most of the nobles loyal to him. As a result, Henry sailed on through, gathering supporters as he went. By this time, Richard was incredibly unpopular, and a day of reckoning was coming. Although people kept telling him he should stage a coup, Henry at first swore that he only wanted his money, not the crown. It was Richard who changed everything. With his distaste for battle, Richard surrendered to his cousin almost immediately after his return and desperately offered Henry the crown in exchange for his life. Following this transferal of power, Henry imprisoned Richard in the Tower of London. Richard regretted his actions almost immediately, launching into a tantrum and demanding his crown. On October 13th, 1399, Henry officially snatched the hollow crown from Richard II, becoming King Henry IV, and then he dealt the final blow. Although Henry had originally promised to spare Richard's life, he quickly realised it was too dangerous to have a former king hanging around. He knew he had to take care of Richard, but the way he did it was beyond cruel. Instead of your regular beheading or even a common hanging, Henry gave Richard a much more torturous end. Little by little, day by day, he starved Richard to death from his cell until the former king succumbed. Then on February 17th, Henry showed off the fruits of his dark labours, displaying Richard's cold, emaciated corpse in St. Paul's Cathedral for all to see. Whether out of guilt or expediency, Henry buried Richard hastily and without fanfare in King's Langley Priory. Eventually though, Richard got something of a happy ending. More than a decade later, Henry's successor said sorry and entombed Richard at Westminster Abbey alongside his beloved Queen Anne. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.